March 14, 1978. Interstate 95, Exit 47, Northern Virginia. A mobile station, 3 miles from Langley. The kind of place where commuters stop for coffee at dawn and truckers refuel before the overnight haul to Philadelphia. Nothing exceptional ever happened there, until the day a 23-year-old attendant named Dennis Kowalski noticed that a customer kept returning with the exact same excuse, the exact same mannerisms, and the exact same dark sunglasses, even on overcast days. What Dennis didn't know was that the man pumping gas into a beige 1975 Ford Granada had been living under a fabricated identity for 12 years, had been trained in a facility outside Moscow, and had successfully transmitted classified defense contractor information to a KGB handler operating out of the Soviet Embassy's commercial attach office. What Dennis also didn't know was that his decision to write down a license plate number on the back of a receipt would collapse an entire network that had cost the Directorate more than $2 million to establish and had compromised at least 7 defense-related projects involving radar countermeasures and satellite reconnaissance technology. The file that eventually made its way to the FBI's Soviet Counterintelligence Division in Washington described the case as fortuitous civilian observation leading to identification of long-term illegal operative. But the language was sterile. It didn't capture the boredom of Dennis Kowalski's afternoon shifts, the way he had started paying attention simply because there was nothing else to do, the way he had mentioned it to his shift manager only because he thought it might be insurance fraud. It didn't capture the 11 hours of interrogation that followed, the polygraph tests, the terror Dennis felt when 2 men in dark suits appeared at his apartment at 6 in the morning and showed him a badge he couldn't quite read through his panic. And it certainly didn't capture what happened to the man in the sunglasses, whose real name was never released, whose photograph never appeared in any newspaper, and whose existence was surgically removed from American soil with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that leaves no trace beyond a memo stamped with a classification level most people will never see. This is not a story about heroism. It's not a story about justice. It's a story about a mundane encounter at a gas station that became a data point in a war fought with invisible ink, microfilm hidden inside batteries, and the suffocating paranoia that turned neighbors into informants and made every transaction a potential security breach. It's a story about how the Cold War turned the ordinary into the suspicious, how a young man who just wanted to finish his shift became an accidental participant in something he would never fully understand, and how an operative who had built an entire American life, complete with a wife who never knew the truth, vanished into a legal black hole that swallowed people without requiring explanations. The war between the United States and the Soviet Union was never declared. No armies faced each other across open battlefields, but every day, in every major city, in every port, in every university and defense contractor's office, in every government building and scientific laboratory, the war continued. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, the front line ran directly through a gas station on a Tuesday afternoon in March, where a young man with grease under his fingernails noticed something that didn't quite fit. Dennis Kowalski had been working at the mobile station for 14 months. It was a job he took after dropping out of community college, where he'd been studying automotive repair but couldn't afford to continue after his father's construction business went under. The station sat on a service road parallel to the interstate, close enough to catch overflow traffic, but far enough that it wasn't constantly busy. The owner, a Lebanese immigrant named Fareed who ran 3 other stations in the area, rarely showed up. The day manager, Pete, was a Korean War veteran who spent most of his time in the back office doing paperwork and listening to AM radio. That left Dennis and 2 other attendants to handle the pumps, the register, the bathrooms, and the occasional complaint about coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn. It was repetitive work. Cars came and went. Regular customers appeared on predictable schedules. The businessman in the Cadillac every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:15, the woman with 2 kids in the station wagon every Saturday morning, The delivery trucks that always wanted diesel and always paid cash. After a few months, Dennis had learned to recognize patterns. Not because he was particularly observant, but because when you stand outside in the cold pumping gas for 8 hours, your mind starts cataloging details just to stay awake. The man in the sunglasses first appeared in late January. He drove a beige Ford Granada, relatively new, clean but not obsessively so. He pulled up to pump 3, got out, and asked Dennis to fill the tank with regular unleaded. He paid with a $20 bill. He wore aviator sunglasses despite the gray winter sky. He didn't make small talk. He didn't ask about the weather or complain about gas prices. He waited by the car, hands in the pockets of a brown leather jacket, until Dennis finished and gave him his change. Then he got back in the car and drove away. Dennis thought nothing of it. Hundreds of people stopped at the station every week, but 3 days later the same man appeared again. Same car, same pump, same request, same sunglasses, same brown jacket, same silence. Dennis filled the tank. The man paid with a 20. He left. A week later it happened again, then 4 days after that, then again. Always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon when the station was quietest. Always the same routine. By the 5th visit, Dennis had started to notice the consistency. The man never smiled. Never acknowledged that he'd been there before. Never said anything beyond regular, unleaded, please and thank you. And he never, under any circumstances, removed the sunglasses. Dennis mentioned it to Pete one afternoon in early February. There's this guy who keeps coming back. Same time, same everything. Kinda weird. Pete looked up from a stack of invoices. He stealing anything? No. He causing trouble? No. Then why do you care? Dennis shrugged. Just seems strange, I guess. Pete went back to his invoices. People are strange. That's not our problem unless they don't pay. But Dennis kept noticing. Not because he suspected anything specific, but because the pattern was impossible to ignore once you saw it. The man appeared roughly every 4 to 6 days, always in the afternoon, always alone, always with the sunglasses. And Dennis began to realize something else. The man never bought anything except gas, never went inside for a soda, never used the bathroom, never checked the oil or asked about tire pressure. He just filled the tank and left. In late February, Dennis started paying attention to the license plate, Virginia tags. He didn't write it down at first, but the next time the man appeared, Dennis made a point of memorizing it. Echo-Charlie-Hotel-7-3-9-2. He repeated it to himself while pumping the gas. When he went on break, he wrote it on the back of a receipt and stuffed it in his pocket. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because there was something unsettling about the man's absolute consistency. Maybe because the sunglasses felt like a disguise. Maybe because in 14 months of working at the station, he'd never seen anyone exhibit such rigid mechanical behavior. Or maybe it was something else, something Dennis couldn't articulate, a vague instinct that this wasn't normal. On March 9th, the man appeared again. This time, Dennis noticed something new. After paying, the man sat in his car for almost 3 minutes before driving away. He didn't start the engine immediately. He just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, facing forward. Dennis watched from the pump island, confused. When the man finally drove off, he turned right onto the service road instead of left toward the interstate, which was the direction he'd always gone before. Dennis mentioned it to Pete again that evening. That guy with the sunglasses, he's been here like 10 times now. Same routine every time. Today he just sat in his car for a while after paying. I don't know, man. It feels off. Pete sighed. You think he's casing the place? Maybe. I don't know. You see him with a weapon? No. You see him take pictures? No. Then stop worrying about it. If he robs us, we've got insurance. But Dennis couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in his studio apartment in Arlington, he tried to figure out what bothered him so much. It wasn't that the man was threatening. It wasn't that he seemed dangerous. It was the opposite. He seemed too careful, too controlled, like someone who had rehearsed every movement. The next time the man appeared, Dennis decided to do something he'd never done before. When the man handed him the $20 bill, Dennis looked directly at his face and said, "You come here a lot. You live around here?" The man paused for half a second. It was barely noticeable, but Dennis caught it. Then the man said, "Not far." Convenient location. His voice was flat. No accent that Dennis could detect, but also no warmth. No personality. Just words delivered with the minimum emotional content required for the exchange. "Yeah," Dennis said, trying to sound casual. "We get a lot of regulars. I just don't usually see someone as regular as you." Another pause. Then the man said, "I travel for work." "This is a good midpoint. What kind of work?" The man didn't answer immediately. He took his change from Dennis's hand and said, "Sales. Medical equipment." Then he got in the car and left. Dennis stood there, receipt in hand, watching the Granada disappear down the service road. Medical equipment sales. It was plausible, but it didn't explain the sunglasses. It didn't explain why someone who supposedly traveled for work always stopped at the same gas station at the same time of day. It didn't explain the mechanical precision of the routine. That night, Dennis told his roommate about it. His roommate, Tony, worked as a line cook at a diner and had exactly zero interest in Dennis's conspiracy theories. "So some weird guy buys gas," Tony said, cracking open a beer. "Welcome to America, dude. Half the people in this country are weird. It's not just that he's weird, it's that he's too consistent. Like he's following a script." Tony laughed. "Maybe he's got OCD or something. Maybe he's a germaphobe and that's why he wears the sunglasses. I don't know." "Why do you care so much?" Dennis didn't have a good answer. He just knew that something felt wrong. On March 14th, the man appeared again. This time, Dennis made a decision. While the man stood by the car waiting for the tank to fill, Dennis memorized every detail he could. The man was approximately 6 feet tall, medium build, clean-shaven, short brown hair visible beneath the sunglasses. He wore a wristwatch on his left hand, simple, no brand visible. His jacket had no logos, no identifiable features. His shoes were brown leather, well-maintained. The car had no bumper stickers, no hanging air fresheners, nothing personal. Even the interior was bare. No papers on the dashboard, no coffee cups. No sign that anyone actually used this car for anything other than driving from point A to point B. When the man paid and left, Dennis went inside and found Pete in the office. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen." Pete put down his clipboard. "What? That guy with the sunglasses? I think something's wrong. I think we should call the police." Pete stared at him. "And tell them what? That a guy buys gas? It's not normal, Pete. He's been here at least 12 times in the last 2 months. Always the same time. Always the same routine. He never goes inside. He never buys anything else. And today I tried talking to him. He said he's in medical equipment sales, but his car is completely empty. No samples, no paperwork, nothing." Pete leaned back in his chair. "Dennis, you've been watching too many cop shows. The guy probably just likes this station. Maybe he's got a thing about routines. That doesn't make him a criminal. Then why does he wear sunglasses when it's overcast? I don't know. Fashion?" Dennis pulled the receipt from his pocket, the one with the license plate number. "I wrote down his plates. I just think maybe we should report it. Just in case." Pete looked at the receipt, then at Dennis. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Pete said, "You really think there's something to this?" "I don't know. But yeah, I do." Pete rubbed his face. "All right, fine. I'll call the non-emergency line. But if this turns out to be nothing, you're doing inventory for the next month," Pete called. He spoke to someone at the Fairfax County Police Department, explained the situation, and gave them the license plate number Dennis had written down. The person on the other end told him they'd look into it and asked if there was any immediate threat. Pete said no. They thanked him for calling and hung up. Dennis expected nothing to happen. He thought maybe a patrol car would drive by sometime in the next week, check the area, and that would be the end of it. He didn't expect 2 men in suits to walk into the station at 6:45 the next morning, before his shift even started, and ask Pete if they could speak to the employee who'd reported the suspicious vehicle. Pete called Dennis at home. "You need to get down here. Now." "Why? What happened?" "Just get down here." When Dennis arrived, the two men were waiting in Pete's office. They didn't introduce themselves by name. They showed him identification that said Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of them, older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a tired expression, asked Dennis to sit down. The other, younger, stood by the door. "You reported a license plate to the Fairfax County Police," the older man said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Dennis said. His heart was pounding. "Yesterday. My manager called." "Why did you report it?" Dennis explained everything. The repeated visits, the sunglasses, the mechanical routine, the lack of personal items in the car. The way the man had hesitated when Dennis asked about his work, the older agent listened without interrupting. When Dennis finished, the agent glanced at his partner, then back at Dennis. "How many times did you interact with this individual?" "Maybe 12, 13 times. He's been coming here since January." "Did he ever threaten you?" "No." "Did he ever ask you questions about yourself, your co-workers, or the station?" "No." "He barely talked. Did you ever see him with anyone else?" "No." "Always alone. Did you ever see him write anything down, take photographs, or use a camera?" "No." The agent leaned forward. "Mr. Kowalski, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not something you can discuss with anyone. Not your manager, not your roommate, not your family. Do you understand?" Dennis nodded, his mouth dry. "The individual you've been observing is a person of significant interest to federal law enforcement. We've been aware of his presence in this area, but we did not know his patterns or routines with this level of detail. Your observations are extremely valuable. However, for operational security reasons, I cannot tell you why we're interested in him, and you cannot tell anyone that we spoke to you. If anyone asks, you tell them that we followed up on your report and determined it was a misunderstanding. Nothing more. Are we clear?" "Yes." The younger agent spoke for the first time. "If this individual returns, you do not change your behavior in any way. You do not stare at him. You do not ask him questions. You treat him exactly the way you've been treating him. If he becomes aware that he's being watched, it will compromise an ongoing investigation. Do you understand?" "Yes." The older agent handed Dennis a business card with no name, just a phone number. "If he appears again, you call this number as soon as he leaves. Do not wait. Do not assume we already know. You call immediately." Dennis took the card. His hands were shaking. The agents left. Pete stood in the doorway, staring at Dennis. "What the hell did you get us into?" "I don't know," Dennis said. But he did know one thing. The man in the sunglasses wasn't just strange, he was something else entirely. And Dennis had just stepped into something far larger and more dangerous than he could have possibly imagined. The man in the sunglasses did not return to the station for 8 days. Dennis kept the business card in his wallet. Every time a beige Granada appeared in his peripheral vision, his heart rate spiked. But it was never the right car, never the right man. He started to wonder if the agents had already arrested him, or worse, if the man had somehow learned that he'd been reported and had disappeared. On March 23rd, the Granada pulled up to Pump 3 at 2:30 in the afternoon. Dennis felt his stomach drop. The man got out wearing the same aviator sunglasses, the same brown leather jacket. He approached Dennis and said, "Regular unleaded, please." Dennis nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. His hands moved on autopilot, unscrewing the gas cap, inserting the nozzle, squeezing the handle. The man stood beside the car, hands in his pockets, facing forward. Exactly the same as always. Dennis's mind raced. The agents had told him not to change his behavior, to act normal. But what was normal? Had he made small talk before? Had he asked questions? He couldn't remember. His thoughts were a tangled mess of adrenaline and fear. The pump clicked. Dennis removed the nozzle and replaced the gas cap. $21.50, he said. The man handed him a $20 bill and 2 singles. Dennis made change, 50 cents. He dropped the coins into the man's palm, careful not to let his hand shake. "Thank you," the man said. He got into the car and drove away. The moment the Granada disappeared from view, Dennis sprinted inside. Pete was at the register. "I need the phone." "What? Now?" Pete handed him the phone. Dennis pulled the business card from his wallet and dialed the number. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered. "Extension? I don't know. I was told to call this number. Your name?" "Dennis Kowalski. I work at a mobile station on. Hold, please." There was a click. Silence. Then the older agent's voice. "Mr. Kowalski." "He was just here. The guy. He just left." "What time?" "Maybe 5 minutes ago." 2:30? "Did he do anything unusual?" "No. Same as always. Filled the tank. Paid. Left." "Which direction did he go?" "Right. Toward the interstate." "Thank you, Mr. Kowalski. Do not leave the station. Someone will be there shortly." The line went dead. Dennis stood there, phone in hand, staring at Pete. "What did they say?" Pete asked. "They said to wait." 20 minutes later, an unmarked sedan pulled into the station. The younger agent got out and walked inside. He gestured for Dennis to follow him outside. They stood beside the sedan, away from the pumps. "Did he say anything to you?" "No, just the usual. Asked for regular unleaded. Said thank you. That's it." "Did he look at you differently? Did he seem nervous?" "No. He was exactly the same." The agent nodded. "Good. That means he doesn't know." He paused. "How long does it usually take him to fill his tank?" 4 or 5 minutes. "Depends on how empty it is. And he always pays cash?" "Always." "Does he ever go inside?" "Never." "Does he ever use the bathroom by anything from the convenience store?" "No. Just gas." The agent pulled out a small notepad and wrote something down. Then he looked at Dennis. "You're doing the right thing. But I need to emphasize again, you cannot tell anyone about this. Not your coworkers. Not your friends. Not your family. If word gets out, it could endanger lives. Do you understand?" Dennis nodded. "If he comes back, you do exactly what you just did. Act normal. Call immediately after he leaves." The agent got back in the sedan and drove away. Dennis returned to the pumps. His legs felt weak. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know who the man was or what he'd done. But the agent's intensity made one thing clear. This wasn't about stolen credit cards or insurance fraud. This was something that justified federal surveillance. Something serious enough that the FBI was watching a gas station in Northern Virginia and waiting for a man who bought gas with mechanical precision. That night, Dennis couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind. The man's flat voice, the expressionless face, the sunglasses that never came off. The way he stood perfectly still, hands in his pockets, while the tank filled. It was unnatural. Everything about him was unnatural, Tony noticed. "You look like hell, man. What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just tired. You've been acting weird for days. What's going on?" "I can't talk about it." Tony raised his eyebrows. "Can't or won't?" "Both." "All right, man. Whatever." The man returned on March 27th. Same time. Same routine. Dennis called the number. The older agent answered. "Any changes?" "No, thank you." The man returned on April 2nd. Dennis called. The agent asked the same questions. Dennis gave the same answers. On April 6th, the man returned, but this time, something was different. When Dennis handed him his change, the man looked directly at him, more at least. Dennis felt like he was being looked at, even though the sunglasses made it impossible to see his eyes. The man said, "You've been working here a long time." Dennis's blood ran cold. "About a year." "Long shifts?" "Sometimes." The man nodded. Then he got in the car and left. Dennis called the number immediately. He talked to me, more than usual. Asked how long I'd been working here. Asked about my shifts. There was a pause on the other end. Then the older agent said, "Did he seem suspicious? Hostile?" "No. Just curious." "All right. Stay calm. He's probably just making small talk. But if he asks anything else, where you live, what your schedule is, anything personal, you deflect. You tell him you're not sure, or you change the subject. Understood?" "Yes. Good. We'll be in touch." But the next time the man came, April 11th, he didn't ask Dennis anything. He was back to silence, back to the routine. Dennis called the number, reported the visit, hung up. This continued through the end of April. The man appeared every 4 to 6 days, always the same. Dennis called the number every time. The agents never told him what was happening, never explained why they were interested, never gave him any information beyond instructions to keep watching and keep reporting. By early May, Dennis was exhausted. The tension of maintaining a normal facade while knowing that every interaction with the man was being monitored, analyzed, and recorded wore on him. He started making mistakes at work, giving the wrong change, forgetting to check oil levels. Pete noticed, but didn't say anything. The other attendants asked if he was all right. Dennis told them he was fine. On May 9th, the man appeared at the station for what would be the last time. Dennis filled the tank. The man paid. He started to get into the car, then paused. He turned back to Dennis and said, "You're a good worker, dependable." Dennis didn't know how to respond. "Thanks," the man nodded. Then he got in the car and drove away. Dennis called the number. He said something weird. Said, "I'm a good worker." Said, "I'm dependable." The older agent's voice was sharp. "What else?" "Nothing. That was it." "Did he seem like he was saying goodbye?" The question made Dennis's skin crawl. "I don't know." "Maybe. All right. If he doesn't return within a week, call us." But the man never returned. A week passed. Then 2. Dennis kept the business card in his wallet. He kept watching the road, expecting the Granada to pull up to pump 3. But it never did. On May 24th, at 6:15 in the morning, before Dennis's shift started, the older agent appeared at the station. He asked Pete if he could speak to Dennis privately. They stood outside near the air pump. "The individual you've been observing has been taken into federal custody," the agent said. "You will not see him again." Dennis stared at him. "What did he do?" "I can't tell you that. Was he dangerous?" "He was a threat to national security." "What does that mean?" The agent looked at Dennis for a long moment. Then he said, "It means you did the right thing. And it means you probably saved lives, though you'll never know whose or how many." "What happens to him now?" "That's classified." "Will there be a trial?" "No." Dennis felt a chill. "No trial?" "Mr. Kowalski, the nature of this case does not permit public proceedings. The individual in question is not a United States citizen. He will be processed through channels that do not involve the civilian legal system." "So what? He just disappears?" The agent didn't answer. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you. Compensation for your time and cooperation." Dennis took the envelope. It felt heavy. "I don't want money. Take it anyway. And remember, you cannot discuss this with anyone ever. If you do, you will face federal charges for compromising an ongoing counterintelligence operation. The non-disclosure agreement you're about to sign makes that very clear." The agent handed him a document. Dennis read through it. It was dense, filled with legal terminology he didn't fully understand. But the message was clear. If he told anyone what had happened, he would go to prison. He signed it. The agent took the document, nodded, and walked back to his car. Dennis stood there watching him drive away. Then he opened the envelope. Inside were 50 $100 bills. He never saw the agent again. Dennis Kowalski never spent the money. He put the envelope in a drawer beneath his socks and tried to forget it existed, but forgetting was impossible. Every time a customer appeared at the station wearing sunglasses, his heart rate accelerated. Every time a beige sedan pulled up to the pumps, he found himself memorizing the license plate before he could stop himself. The gas station, which had once been just a job, tedious, repetitive, forgettable, had become a place where he relived the same encounter over and over, searching for clues he'd missed, wondering what would have happened if he'd never written down that license plate number. Pete never asked about the envelope or the agents or what had happened. He'd signed a non-disclosure agreement too, though his was shorter, less severe. The agents had made it clear that Pete's involvement was peripheral, that he'd simply made a phone call and nothing more. But Pete knew enough to understand that whatever Dennis had stumbled into wasn't something you talked about. So they worked side by side in silence, the unspoken weight of it hanging between them like smoke. Tony, Dennis's roommate, noticed the change. "You've been different since March," he said one night in June, both of them sitting in their cramped living room watching a Orioles game on a television with bad reception. "Something happened." "You gonna tell me what?" "Nothing happened." "Bullshit. You barely sleep. You barely eat. You keep staring out the window like you're expecting someone." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." Dennis didn't respond. He couldn't. The non-disclosure agreement sat in his mind like a locked door. Behind it were all the things he wanted to say, all the questions he wanted to ask, all the fear and confusion that had nowhere to go. So he kept it inside, and it festered. By July, Dennis had started looking for another job. Not because he wanted to leave the station, but because every day he spent there felt like standing on a trap door that could open at any moment. He applied to auto repair shops, warehouses, delivery companies, and where that wasn't the mobile station on exit 47. But every interview ended the same way. They'd ask why he was leaving his current job, and he'd give some vague answer about wanting new opportunities, and they'd look at him like they didn't quite believe him. No one hired him. In August, a man in a suit appeared at the station. Not one of the agents Dennis had met before. Someone new. He asked for Dennis by name. Pete called him over. The man showed Dennis a badge. Department of Defense, Office of Security. He asked Dennis to step outside. They walked to the edge of the parking lot, away from the pumps. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm here to conduct a follow-up interview regarding the incident earlier this year." Dennis felt his stomach tighten. "I already told the FBI everything. I understand. This is standard procedure. Just a few questions to ensure consistency in the record." The man pulled out a notepad. "You first observed the subject in late January of this year, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you estimated he visited the station approximately 12 to 13 times between January and May?" "Around that, yeah." "During these visits, did the subject ever display any items that suggested foreign origin? Newspapers in a foreign language, for instance?" "No. I never saw him with anything." "Did he ever mention travel to foreign countries?" "No. He said he worked in medical equipment sales. That's all." "Did you ever observe him speaking to anyone else at the station? Other customers? Other employees?" "No. He always came alone." The man continued asking questions for another 20 minutes. Most of them were things Dennis had already answered in March. When the interview ended, the man thanked Dennis for his cooperation and left. No explanation, no context. Just questions, and then silence. 2 weeks later, another man appeared. This time from the FBI's Washington field office. Same routine. Same questions. Dennis answered them again, word for word, the same as before, because he'd memorized his own story by now. It was the only version of events he was allowed to tell, and repetition had turned it into a script. In September, Dennis received a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a government seal at the top. The letter informed him that he was required to report to a federal building in Washington, D.C. on September 18th at 9 o'clock in the morning for a debriefing. Session related to matters of national security previously disclosed. Failure to appear would result in legal action. Dennis took the bus into the city. The building was unmarked, a gray concrete structure near DuPont Circle with no signs indicating what agency occupied it. He showed the letter to a security guard at the entrance. The guard checked his identification, made a phone call, and directed him to the 3rd floor. A woman in a dark blazer met him in the hallway. She didn't introduce herself. She led him to a small conference room with no windows. Inside were 3 men in suits. One of them was the older FBI agent Dennis had met in March. The others were strangers. "Mr. Kowalski, thank you for coming," the older agent said. "Please, sit." Dennis sat. His hands were sweating. One of the strangers spoke. He was younger, maybe 40, with short blonde hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested military background. "Mr. Kowalski, what we're about to tell you is classified. You are not to repeat this information to anyone. The non-disclosure agreement you signed in May remains in effect. Do you understand?" "Yes." The man opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed the man from the gas station. No sunglasses this time, just his face. Brown hair, pale skin. Unremarkable features. He looked like 1,000 other middle-aged men Dennis had seen in his life. "This individual's name is not relevant," the man said. "What is relevant is that he was a Soviet intelligence operative living under deep cover in the United States. He had been operating here for 12 years. During that time, he successfully penetrated a defense contractor in Arlington and transmitted classified information regarding radar, countermeasures, and satellite reconnaissance technology to his handlers at the Soviet embassy." Dennis stared at the photograph. The man who had stood beside Pump 3 wearing sunglasses, saying regular unleaded please in that flat, emotionless voice, had been a Soviet spy. A real spy. Not someone pretending. Not someone in a movie. A real operative, trained in Moscow, sent to live an entire fabricated life in America for over a decade. The information he transmitted compromised 7 ongoing defense projects, the man continued. The damage assessment is still being conducted, but preliminary estimates suggest that the Soviet Union gained access to technology that could reduce the effectiveness of our early warning radar systems by as much as 30%. That means if they launch a first strike, we have less time to respond. That means more American cities could be destroyed before we even know the missiles are in the air. Dennis felt sick. Your observation of this individual's patterns led directly to his identification and apprehension. Without your report, he would have continued operating indefinitely. You need to understand the significance of that. Dennis didn't feel significant. He felt like he was drowning. The older FBI agent leaned forward. "We know this is difficult, Mr. Kowalski, but we need you to understand why secrecy is so important. The operative you identified was part of a network. We've been dismantling that network for the past 4 months. If word gets out, if the Soviets learn how we identified him, they'll change their protocols. They'll adapt. And we'll lose our ability to identify others like him." "Are there others?" Dennis asked. The agent didn't answer. But the silence was answer enough. The blond man closed the folder. "You will not be contacted again unless absolutely necessary. You will not receive further compensation. You will not be publicly acknowledged for your role in this matter. From the government's perspective, this conversation never happened. You go back to your life, and you never speak of this again." Dennis nodded. They let him leave. He took the bus back to Arlington. He sat in the back, staring out the window at the city passing by. Thousands of people going about their lives, unaware that somewhere among them were men and women who weren't who they claimed to be. People with false names, false histories, false lives. People who had been trained to blend in so completely that even their spouses didn't know the truth. The man at the gas station had been one of them, and Dennis had found him by accident. By noticing a pattern. By writing down a license plate number on the back of a receipt because he had nothing better to do during a slow shift. When Dennis got home, Tony was in the kitchen making spaghetti. "Where were you? Doctor's appointment. You all right?" "Yeah. Just routine." Tony didn't press. Dennis went to his room and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the man in the sunglasses. He thought about the wife the agents had mentioned, someone who had lived with a Soviet operative for years and never knew. He thought about the defense contractors who had trusted someone they shouldn't have. He thought about the radar systems and the satellites and the missiles and the 30% reduction in warning time. He thought about how fragile everything was. How the entire architecture of safety and security that people took for granted was held together by luck and coincidence and gas station attendants who happened to notice things. The details of what happened to the man Dennis had identified were never made public. No trial, no newspaper article, no press conference. In the official record, he simply ceased to exist. But through fragments of overheard conversations, through hints dropped by the agents during debriefings, through the things they didn't say as much as the things they did, Dennis pieced together a version of the story. The man had entered the United States in 1966 under a Canadian identity. His legend, the fabricated backstory that gave him a plausible reason to be in America, was that he'd grown up in Toronto, studied engineering at McGill University, and moved to the United States for work opportunities. His documentation was flawless. Birth certificate, school records, employment history, even a driver's license with a photograph that matched his face. All of it false. All of it created by the KGB's Directorate S, the branch responsible for managing illegals operatives who lived abroad without official cover, without diplomatic protection, without any connection to Soviet embassies or consulates. He'd worked as a technical consultant, moving from company to company, always in industries adjacent to defense. Never directly employed by a defense contractor, but always close enough to meet people who were. He attended industry conferences. He joined professional organizations. He cultivated relationships slowly, carefully, over years. He was patient. That was the defining characteristic of a good illegal: patience, the willingness to spend a decade building a false life just to access a single piece of information. In 1974, he married an American woman. A real person with a real life, who had no idea that the man she was marrying had been trained in a facility outside Moscow, that his name wasn't real, that everything he'd told her about his childhood was a lie. They bought a house in Fairfax. They talked about having children. She worked as a librarian. He worked as a consultant. They were ordinary, unremarkable, invisible, and then, in 1976, he got the access he'd been working toward. A friend from a professional conference recommended him for a contract position with a defense firm in Arlington. The work was administrative, not technical, managing documentation, coordinating between departments. But it gave him access to buildings, to people, to schedules, and that was enough. He didn't steal documents. That would have been too risky. Instead, he memorized things: meeting schedules, names of project leads, hints about what certain teams were working on. And once every few weeks he would drive to a predetermined location, sometimes a park, sometimes a shopping mall parking lot, sometimes a rest stop along the interstate, and he would meet his handler, a Soviet diplomat with official cover, protected by diplomatic immunity, who would debrief him and pass along instructions. The meetings were brief, 10 minutes, maybe 15. They looked like two strangers who happened to be in the same place. The handler would sit on a bench. The illegal would walk by. They would exchange a few words. "Excuse me, do you have the time?" "Yes, it's 3:15. Simple. Meaningless to anyone watching, but coded. The time, the day of the week, the location, all of it conveyed information. But every intelligence operation has vulnerabilities. And for this particular illegal, the vulnerability was routine. He needed to maintain his cover as a consultant who traveled frequently, which meant he needed an excuse to be on the road at irregular times. So he established a pattern. Every time he had a meeting with his handler, he would make the drive look like part of his normal routine. He would stop for gas at the same station at roughly the same time to create a plausible reason for being in that area. It was a small detail, a minor piece of tradecraft, but it was a pattern. And patterns, no matter how carefully constructed, are always dangerous. Dennis learned most of this in fragments, over months, from comments made by the agents during follow-up interviews. But the full picture didn't come together until years later. Long after he'd left the gas station, long after he'd tried to forget the whole thing. What Dennis didn't learn, what he would never learn, was what happened to the man after he was taken into federal custody. There are procedures for dealing with illegals, protocols established during the early days of the Cold War, refined over decades, codified in classified directives that exist in locked filing cabinets in buildings that don't appear on any map. These protocols are designed to handle a specific problem. What do you do with someone who is not a diplomat, who has no official protection, who is not even legally present in the country under their real identity, but who possesses information that could be valuable? The answer is simple. You make them disappear, not in the dramatic sense, not with violence or theatrics, but through a process that is calm, methodical, and utterly impersonal. You remove them from the place where they were arrested. You transport them to a facility that specializes in counterintelligence debriefings. You isolate them completely. No lawyers, no phone calls, no contact with the outside world. And then you begin the process of extraction. Extraction in this context doesn't mean rescue. It means taking everything they know and transferring it into reports, transcripts, and file folders. You ask questions. You verify answers. You cross-reference their statements with signals intelligence, with surveillance logs, with intercepted communications. You map their network. You identify their handlers, their contacts, their dead drops, their communication protocols. You learn everything there is to learn. And when there's nothing left to extract, when every piece of useful information has been cataloged and analyzed, you make a decision. Sometimes, if the individual is valuable enough, you offer them a deal. Defection in exchange for cooperation. A new identity, a new life, resettlement in a location far from anywhere they've ever been. It's rare, but it happens. More often, though, the decision is deportation. You put them on a plane, send them back to the Soviet Union, and let the KGB deal with them. Because an illegal who's been caught is worse than useless to the Soviets. They're a liability. They've been compromised. Their cover is blown. Their network is exposed. And in the Soviet system, failure of that magnitude doesn't result in a comfortable retirement. But sometimes, very rarely, the decision is something else entirely. Something that doesn't fit neatly into public records or official statements. Something that happens in the spaces between diplomacy and law, where actions are justified by national security and documented only in files that will remain classified for 50 years. The man Dennis had identified fell into this third category. He was not offered defection, he was not deported, according to the fragments. Dennis pieced together from overheard conversations and implications buried in the questions the agents asked him, the man was transferred to a military facility. Not a prison, not officially. Just a place where people who posed unique security challenges could be held indefinitely under legal frameworks that didn't require public disclosure. He remained there for 11 months. During that time, he was debriefed extensively. Every operation he'd been part of, every piece of information he'd transmitted, every contact he'd made. The debriefings were not coercive in the traditional sense. No physical torture, no threats of violence. Just time. Endless time. Days blending into weeks, blending into months, sitting in a windowless room answering the same questions over and over while analysts compared his answers to intelligence gathered from other sources. And then, in April of 1979, he was gone. No record of a trial, no record of deportation, no record of release. Just a notation in a classified file. Subject transferred per Directive 197C. Further inquiries to be directed to OGA Liaison, OGA, Other Government Agency. A euphemism used in intelligence documents to avoid naming the CIA. What happened after that transfer, Dennis would never know. No one would. Because once someone disappears into that particular bureaucratic void, they cease to exist in any meaningful sense. They're not dead, at least, not officially. They're just gone, erased. A data point in a system designed to protect secrets by making inconvenient people vanish without leaving evidence. Years later, in 1995, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, Dennis saw a news report about a prisoner exchange. The United States and Russia are no longer the Soviet Union, but the Russian Federation had agreed to swap several individuals who had been held on espionage-related charges. The report showed grainy footage of men in winter coats walking across a bridge in Berlin. The same bridge where Cold War exchanges had taken place for decades. Glienicke Bridge. The Bridge of Spies. Dennis watched the footage and wondered if the man from the gas station was among them. If he'd spent 16 years in custody, waiting, if he'd been sent back to Moscow, to a country that no longer existed in the form he'd left it, to a system that had collapsed while he was locked away, or if he was still somewhere else, still in a facility that didn't officially exist, still answering questions that no one else would ever hear. Dennis never found out. And eventually he stopped wondering. The gas station remained a gas station. Dennis continued working there through the end of 1978, but by January of 1979, he couldn't take it anymore. Every shift felt like waiting for something terrible to happen. Every customer felt like a potential threat. The agents had told him there were others, other illegals, other operatives embedded in American life, and now Dennis saw them everywhere. In the businessman who bought premium gasoline every Tuesday, in the woman who always paid with exact change, and the truck driver who asked too many questions about the interstate routes. He quit in February. Told Pete he was moving to Pennsylvania to work for his uncle's construction company. It was a lie, but Pete didn't question it. They shook hands. Dennis walked out and never came back. He found work at an auto repair shop in Silver Spring. The pay was worse, but it didn't matter. He needed distance from Exit 47, from Pump 3, from the memory of a man in aviator sunglasses standing beside a beige Granada. But the distance didn't help, because the fundamental truth Dennis had learned, that the world was not what it appeared to be. That people were not who they claimed to be. That the entire surface of normal life was a thin membrane stretched over an abyss of deception and violence. That truth didn't go away. He started drinking. Not heavily, not at first. Just a beer after work, then 2, then 3. By 1980, he was drinking every night. Tony, his roommate, moved out. Said he couldn't deal with Dennis's paranoia anymore. Dennis didn't blame him. In 1981, Dennis was arrested for driving under the influence. He spent a night in jail. The judge gave him a suspended sentence and ordered him to attend AA meetings. He went to 3 meetings and stopped. The meetings required talking about your problems, and Dennis's problem was something he legally could not talk about. He moved to Baltimore in 1982. Found work at a warehouse loading trucks. The job required no interaction with customers, no observation, no pattern recognition, just physical labor. Lift, carry, stack, repeat. It was exactly what he needed. He met a woman named Karen in 1983. She worked as a waitress at a diner near the warehouse. They dated for 6 months. She asked him about his past, and he gave vague answers. She asked why he didn't talk about his family, and he said they weren't close. She asked why he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and stared at the window like he expected someone to be there, and he said it was just insomnia. She left him in 1984. Said she couldn't be with someone who kept so much of himself locked away. Dennis didn't argue. He knew she was right. By 1985, Dennis had stopped trying to build a normal life. He worked, he paid rent, he existed. That was enough. He thought about the man in the sunglasses sometimes. Wondered if he'd had a wife who mourned him. Wondered if the woman he'd married, the librarian in Fairfax, had ever learned the truth. Or if the FBI had told her he'd died in an accident, or simply vanished. Wondered if she'd spent years searching for answers that would never come. He thought about the $5,000 in the envelope, still sitting in a drawer somewhere in an apartment he didn't live in anymore. Blood money. Payment for betraying someone whose only crime, from Dennis's perspective, had been buying gas too consistently. Except that wasn't true, and Dennis knew it. The man hadn't been innocent. He'd been a spy. He'd stolen military secrets. He'd compromised American security. He'd put lives at risk. The agents had made that very clear. But knowing that didn't make Dennis feel better. Because the truth was, Dennis hadn't reported the man because he suspected espionage. He'd reported him because the pattern was annoying. Because he was bored. Because he wanted something interesting to happen during his shift. And something interesting had happened, and it had destroyed him. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Dennis watched the news footage of the Berlin Wall coming down, of the hammer and sickle being lowered from the Kremlin, of Gorbachev resigning and Yeltsin taking power. The Cold War was over. The enemy that had justified decades of paranoia and secrecy and surveillance had simply ceased to exist. Dennis wondered if the man from the gas station knew. If he was still alive somewhere watching the same footage, realizing that everything he'd sacrificed, his identity, his freedom, 12 years of living a lie, had been for nothing. Or maybe he was dead. Maybe he'd died in custody and no one had bothered to record it. Maybe he'd been executed quietly, his body buried in an unmarked grave at a facility that didn't officially exist. Maybe the Soviet Union had traded him back in some secret exchange that never made the news, and he'd been sent to a gulag for failing his mission. Dennis would never know. And that was the worst part. Not the fear, not the paranoia, not the guilt, but the not knowing. The certainty that he had set something in motion, that his actions had consequences, but that those consequences were forever hidden behind walls of classification and bureaucratic opacity. He thought about the agent's words. "You probably saved lives, though you'll never know whose or how many." But what lives had he saved? The radar systems that weren't compromised? The satellites that continued functioning? The early warning systems that retained their full effectiveness? Those weren't lives. Those were abstractions. Numbers on a damage assessment report. The only life Dennis knew he'd affected was the man in the sunglasses, and that life he'd destroyed. In 1998, Dennis received a letter. Plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was brief. "Mr. Kowalski, your cooperation in 1978 regarding a matter of national security contributed significantly to the protection of critical defense assets during a period of heightened geopolitical tension. This letter serves as formal acknowledgement of your service. Please be advised that all non-disclosure agreements previously signed remain in effect in perpetuity. Unauthorized disclosure will result in federal prosecution. No signature, no agency name, just a seal at the bottom that Dennis didn't recognize." He burned the letter in his kitchen sink, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then he washed the ash down the drain and opened a beer. 20 years had passed since that afternoon in March when he'd written down a license plate number. 20 years of carrying a secret he couldn't share, a story he couldn't tell, a weight he couldn't put down. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, even decades later, was that he still didn't know if he'd done the right thing. The agents had told him he'd saved lives. They'd told him he'd protected national security. They'd told him he was a patriot. But Dennis had never felt like a patriot. He'd felt like a snitch. Like someone who'd seen something unusual and, instead of minding his own business, had decided to call the authorities. And because of that decision, a man had disappeared. A woman had lost her husband. A network had been destroyed. Lives had been ruined. Was that justice? Was that security? Or was it just the machinery of the state grinding forward, crushing everything in its path because that's what machinery does? Dennis didn't have answers. He'd spent 20 years looking for them, and he still didn't have answers. All he had were memories. The man in the aviator sunglasses. The flat voice saying regular unleaded, please. The mechanical precision of the routine. The way the agents had appeared at 6 in the morning. Showing badges and asking questions and making it very clear that Dennis's life would never be the same. And the knowledge unshakable, inescapable, that the Cold War had never been fought on distant battlefields or in secret bunkers or at diplomatic summits. It had been fought in gas stations and libraries and defense contractor offices. It had been fought in the ordinary places where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, never knowing that the person standing next to them might not be who they claimed to be. That was the real front line, not missiles, not tanks, not soldiers. Just people, people pretending, people watching, people trying to figure out who was real and who wasn't, who could be trusted and who couldn't, who was telling the truth and who was lying. And in that war, there were no heroes, just survivors. People who made it through without getting crushed. People who kept their secrets and carried their guilt and tried to find a way to live with what they'd done. Dennis Kowalski was one of those people. And every day for the rest of his life he would wake up and remember the man in the sunglasses and wonder if reporting him had been an act of courage or an act of cowardice. He would never know, because that's what the Cold War did. It took simple moral questions and made them impossible. It turned right and wrong into abstractions. It made everyone complicit in systems they didn't understand, pursuing goals they couldn't see, serving interests they couldn't name. And when it was over, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and everyone said the good guys had won, Dennis didn't feel like a winner. He felt like someone who'd survived a car crash, alive but not whole, functional but not healed. If stories like this make you rethink how close the world came to losing itself, consider subscribing. These are not just stories. They are warnings. Because the mechanisms that made the Cold War possible, the surveillance, the secrecy, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for abstract notions of security, those mechanisms didn't disappear. They evolved. They adapted. They found new justifications. And somewhere right now, in a gas station or a coffee shop or an airport or a grocery store, someone is noticing a pattern. Someone is seeing something that doesn't quite fit. And they're deciding whether to report it or ignore it, whether to call the authorities or mind their own business. And whatever they decide, it will have consequences. Consequences that ripple forward through time. Consequences that destroy lives and save lives and reshape the invisible architecture that holds society together. Dennis Kowalski made his decision. He wrote down a license plate number. And for the rest of his life, he carried the weight of that choice. This is his story. And it's a warning.